Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fourth national debate on resilience in the water sector on what next for combined sewer overflows, or CSOs. It's really fantastic to see so many people online and more registrants joining all of the time. So before I hand over to the chair for this morning's event, I wanted to provide a short background to explain where the concept of our debate has come from. So across the universities of Cranfield, Sheffield and Newcastle, we host an EPSRC funded Centre for Doctoral Training in Water Infrastructure and Resilience, also known as WIRE. This collaborative programme between industry and academia has trained nearly 60 PhD students over the last 5 years and has just been further funded to train a further 60 PhD students over the next 5 years. And that's with the aim of producing really highly qualified graduates with the technical and management skills to make a real difference to the water sector. So as part of the programme, we want people to understand some of the real issues and challenges that the water sector is facing and understand the complexity behind some of these challenges, and to really think about whether what the public see about these issues truly reflects the problem and those complexities. And so for the last few years, we've brought together experts in the field of various important topics so we can really inform on the discussion and the debate. So I'm really pleased this year that we are tackling a really important matter related to water resilience and sustainability, the controversial and somewhat vexing issue of combined sewer overflows and the role that they play in the management of our water systems. As the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, has said in the hot off the press Royal Academy of Engineering Testing the Waters report, wastewater systems have been one of the greatest public health triumphs over the last 200 years, responsible for saving millions of lives globally. But it seems now the public expect more as they have access to more data, increased awareness of water quality, and with more recreational activities taking place in the rivers and seas. So there is an increased focus on risk and what makes these risks acceptable. So this has given rise to that huge focus on CSOs. And so whether that is fair or correct is the focus of today's discussion. So we have a great agenda of keynote talks, followed by the discussion debate itself. And that's including a student voice who is really well versed in this fascinating topic. So throughout the day's agenda, you'll be able to post questions and discussion points through the chat function in Zoom. But during the first talks, there'll be no Q&A. So instead, we'll save those questions until the debate part of the programme. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our debate chair for the morning, and that's Nikki Roach, who is Director of Blue Green Consulting, past president of CIWEM, which is the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, and who hosts the brilliant Planet Possible podcast, which I would strongly recommend that you all subscribe to for some really interesting discussions and views on the environment. So, Nikki, over to you.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the Planet Possible plug. It is my absolute pleasure to be chairing this fourth national debate on resilience in the water sector. And as someone who has spent my career working in and around the sector, I haven't experienced a time where there has been so much external interest in how our water and wastewater services are managed and the impact that they have on both the environment and public health. So it feels very timely that our debate today is about reducing spills from storm overflows, particularly because here in Cranfield, Pete and I were just remarking, it's absolutely chucking it down at the moment. This is a topic that 5 years ago, it would have been unlikely to generate a conversation beyond perhaps a few experts in the sector. And today, for those of us working in the environment space, it's almost a daily occurrence when people ask you where you work. And the reason I'm particularly delighted to be chairing today is that I firmly believe that the national conversation around storm overflows will benefit from having discussions like these, where we explore the detail behind the now frequent headlines, reducing a complex set of interconnected human and natural systems to a set of sound bites, binary good or bad outcomes, doesn't create space to explore the nuance and the sometimes unintended consequences of the decisions that we make across our systems. Perhaps we are at an inflection point. The recent report that Pete mentioned by the Royal Academy of Engineering, Testing Our Water, has suggested that while environmental health has been the focus of our wastewater systems historically, perhaps in future, public health needs to be of equal priority. So we're going to get into that and much more this morning with our excellent panel and keynote speakers. And this is a debate that you, our audience, are absolutely key to. There is no point in us talking to ourselves. We have to listen. And so, as Pete said, send in your questions and we'll put all of those, or a selection of them, hopefully there'll be lots, to our panelists in the Q&A that will follow our four keynote speakers. Our guests today represent a really broad range of stakeholders and a broad range of views. And what's key is that we'll have a chance to listen to each other's perspectives, find some common ground, of which I'm sure there is more than we perhaps expect, and discuss robustly what the direction ahead could and should look like. And so, without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker this morning. He is the Chief Executive of Surfers Against Sewage. A very warm welcome, Giles Bristow. Welcome, Giles.
Thank you very much for having me. Delighted to be here. So yes, I'm the Chief Executive of Surfers Against Sewage. We're a registered charity campaigning to protect the ocean. And I've got some slides, so hopefully they move on. Yeah. So if you don't know us, Surfers Against Sewage is a movement of people connected by our love of water. We started in 1990 by a passionate group of Cornish surfers operating out of a couple of camper vans in St Agnes Village Hall. We draw our mandate and our reach from a supporter base of hundreds of thousands of people across the UK. And we work with communities on issues that affect them locally and take their stories, their data and their insight to politicians and policymakers. In this way, we work from the beachfront to the front bench. So this is a picture of us in 1990s. 35 years on, we are more than surfers and we're about more than sewage. We work across many issues: climate, plastic, ocean restoration. But in relation to water quality, our movement is demanding an end to sewage pollution in bathing waters, the places where we swim and surf and go to relax and connect with nature, and high priority nature sites by 2030 at the absolute latest. This is what we look like now, sort of a bit more modern, but nevertheless, we try to have an engaging brand that brings people to this issue. So today we're going to get stuck into the detail around CSOs, the technical data policy and the social constructs around it, but I wanted to bring you back to what we're really talking about. Water companies in the UK are allowed to release treated wastewater into rivers, into the sea, and untreated wastewater during exceptional circumstances, known as storm overflows. Discharges are made from combined sewer overflows, where surface water runoff is combined with wastewater from toilet and bathrooms, etc. And they were designed as a safety valve, a backstop. But they've become a means of operationally managing capacity issues in the system. And this is not what they were intended for or regulated for. So untreated sewage is being discharged outside these licensed operations, driven by capacity issues, poorly maintained equipment, pumps and pipes and the like, emergencies, and possibly due to the incremental relaxation of exceptional circumstances as the definition of when untreated sewage is allowed to be discharged. And this has been by the sort of water company practice, but also the regulators and government in over time as we've been using that definition. Very, very obviously, if sewage is flowing into our rivers and onto our beaches and into our sea, the environment is damaged. It is polluted. Biodiversity is affected. Sewage fungus smothers these environments, starving of oxygen and reducing ecological resilience of these environments. It also poses a serious threat to human well-being. But E. coli, enterococci, new viruses, antimicrobial resistant bacteria, microplastic toxins, and forever chemicals are all part of this cocktail. If contaminated water is ingested or swallowed, perhaps because you swim or surf in this water, then you are likely to get sick, perhaps seriously. And last year, we received over 2,000, so to Surfers Against Sewage, we received nearly 2,000 reports directed to us of sickness. What was really interesting is 60% of those reports of people getting sick from surfing related to activities taking place in what's called excellent bathing waters, to apparently our cleanest bathing waters, yet people were still getting sick. We have a ton of case studies written up on our website. Do go and have a look. But they involve people like Ruben, so a physics teacher who got an infection from surfing and unfortunately had to give up his job. It was very serious. He's ended up with a long-term condition that meant he's unable to hold down his job. We have lots of case studies like that on our website. And there's an increasing amount of evidence around this link of sewage pollution and human health. And, by the way, animals. Dogs get sick a lot too, often in these environments with their human owners. Won't dwell. But for the purpose of today, the thing I want to bring to you is that this pollution is not going unnoticed. The public are becoming very aware of the state of our rivers and seas. About 7.5 million people, adults that is, enjoy regular paddle sports in the UK. And we've seen an explosion in wild swimming, in other words, and surfing. And as more people go in the water, the more they are getting disillusioned with the state it's in. Hundreds of thousands of people have first-hand experience of swimming in raw sewage, perhaps getting ill, and witnessing the ecological destruction of places they love. And they are outraged. They're outraged because they've been paying their bills for clean water, yet still getting ill and seeing this destruction. And now together, we are calling for government and regulators and water companies to do better. The more people learn, the more angry they become, and they are worried about the threat that sewage presents to those entering the water to swim, paddle, and dip. In relation to the English water companies, people feel extra outraged because they feel there's been a focus on profiting perhaps from pollution, as the industry has distributed about £78 billion in shareholder returns, so dividends from investments, whilst they have a record of poor pollution environment. So people are angry. They feel a real sense of injustice around this. So when we at Surfers Against Sewage talk about the 584,000 recorded untreated discharge events across England and Wales and Scotland last year, or the 4.6 million hours of untreated sewage discharge, all of these likely to, by the way, to be an underestimate, we need to remember that we are talking about thousands of local tragedies, individual events, but that add up to a national picture of disgrace, really, in how we're treating our waterways. Every time there is a discharge, people are at risk of getting ill and the environment further degraded. So the public are calling for better. Last weekend, we had what's called the National Paddle Out. We had 35 events across the country where people come to turn their anger, if you like, into action, and they're demanding better. Specifically this year, we were asking people to contact Ofwat, to send the chair of Ofwat an email saying, hold this industry to account, do your job, and ensure that the investment plans for the next 5 years will make a difference. So what's the future, as we see it, of CSOs? Well, over the last year, we've seen a real flurry of government policy to tackle this issue. We've seen the Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan, the Environmental Improvement Plan, and a Plan for Water. These set out how government intends to tackle the issue. And we're delighted to see this. It's the first time we've seen action being taken and written down in documentation. We've been campaigning for over 30 years on this. So that's a good step forward. And we're pleased to see an increase in enforcement budget for the EA and new research into things like AMR. However, this is way not sufficient. Under current plans, water users will have to wait until 2035 to be safe in the knowledge that bathing waters, that's where we swim and surf and kayak, are clean. And not until 2045, another 21 years away, before high priority nature sites are safe. That is a long time to wait for water companies to comply with legislation that has existed since 1991. So for water users, we really want to see an accelerated set of investment and impacts being made. Ultimately, we're unlikely to see this, with the change that we need, without this. So we require a regulator with teeth that enforces the law, transparency from water companies, and ambitious timelines to solve these problems. So we think government can go further faster and very quickly, together with a load of other sports governing bodies and water users and campaigning NGOs. We've created an End Sewage Pollution Manifesto, sets out very simple, if you like, almost more like principles for a cleaner, better system that delivers outcomes for the environment and for human health. We can talk about that later if you want, available on our website. But I just wanted to leave you with a final thought. Just this is my final thought, if you like, that this is a complex system. It is broken, and we need to think about what systemic transformation of the system looks like. So we need, ultimately, a new conversation about water and the relationship between humans and our habitats with water. Where does it come from? How do we use it? How much are we prepared to pay for it? Who owns the system? How is it distributed? Fixing, if you like, the engineering is definitely not enough. We need to transform the system. It'd be wrong to dig a whole load of hills and hold and line them in concrete with the associated carbon emissions from that just to create more storage, when that storage is likely to be a temporary breather as climate change advances and our weather patterns change. So that would be the wrong thing to do. We think you must think holistically about catchments and think about the role that nature can play in wastewater management and capturing water as a resource. We need to think about what we want out of the system and the principles that govern it. No one should profit from pollution, and we need to incentivize environmental improvement over CEOs' bonuses and shareholder returns. We need to think about who owns and operates this various aspects of the system and who benefits from the investment. We need to think really hard about how we finance its upgrade. The gap we have to close on environmental improvement is colossal. We need a massive investment in infrastructure for this very broken system. But it can't be right that we just invite any capital in. Capital is not agnostic of the outcome. So we need to think about what type of capital flows into this system and how will they benefit and who gets the benefit of that investment. So this is not a conversation about engineering. It's a much wider conversation about power, politics, and money. So where do we start? Well, on this side, this is a long conversation, but we think it has to start with water companies rebuilding trust with the public. This means showing they're serious about sorting this mess out, and this will require systemic and transformational cultural change within water companies themselves. We need radical honesty, radical openness and transparency, and revolutionary levels of investment. And this must start now and be evidenced in this next set of water company investment plans that we'll see in the next couple of weeks. So that's my opening thoughts.
Super. Thank you so much, Giles. That was great. And plenty of food for thought in our first 10 minutes, and probably beautifully followed really by our next speaker, because I imagine that he's going to pick up on many of the points that you've just raised. So I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, and that's Mark Worsfold. Mark is the Director of Asset Management at South West Water. So a very warm welcome to you, Mark.
Morning, everybody, and thank you for allowing me to come and speak this morning. Most people will think that I would now just go completely and say completely a lot of things in completely the opposite to what Giles has just said. But actually, there's a lot of similar themes and a lot of similar issues that are coming through in my presentation as well. So if we could just go to the first slide, and I'll start working my way through that. So the first question is, should the future of wastewater be different? And the answer to that is yes, of course it should. And we need to think about how that is the case. We could move to the next slide, please. We talk a lot about the sewage scandal, and a lot has been made, and Giles has just covered that quite beautifully in terms of there is a lot of social media, a lot of challenge about what is occurring, and it all focuses on the word sewage. And actually, I'd like to kind of flip the message here, because the message is actually about the fact that we've too much rainwater in our sewer network, and that rainwater is entering from quite a number of different pathways. The result of too much rainwater is that then we see premature CSO operation, and we see it occurring quite a lot across the network. And that is happening as a result of lots of different sources of rainwater entering into the sewer network, which is an open network, and lots of different discharges occur. We'll touch on some of those in a moment. But one thing to just note, sorry, my phone's just started. One thing to just note is that actually we've been on a long journey of this. And then in 1989, and these are some stats that aren't that clear and visible to a lot of people, particularly in the southwest, 30% of sewage was actually pushed out to sea and was untreated. And a lot of investment has occurred since privatisation, and in the southwest, it was the Clean Sweep programme, which has now taken us to the point where the modelling and everything that we do looks like we're currently treating about 97% of the sewage in the region, with 3% then discharging through storm overflows. Now that's quite a significant movement. The Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive sets the challenge that only 4% can be passing through storm overflows. So we're beating that position. The revised Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive is moving that to 2%. And when all of the targets that are delivered around the storm overflow discharge reduction plan are complete, we estimate that we'll be in the region of about 1% that will be going through storm overflows. Now, those are just statistics. I can imagine a lot of people are going, that's not good enough. We want it to be better than that. And we understand that and we recognise that. And as an industry, we are looking at what our response is and how do we improve that. But let's go back to this issue of too much rainwater entering the sewer first. If we can move to the next slide. Here we tried to look at what are all the different sources of water that go into the sewer network. And we can see examples there where there is the classic kind of water that should be going into a combined sewer, which is, and as the Water Act recalls it, buildings in appurtenant yards, which is in and around properties, runoff from drives, buildings, and foul sewage from toilets as well. But we have all of these other sources of rainwater that enter the sewer. So a lot of highway drainage. We have cases where a lot of land drainage is running off, particularly in rural areas, going onto the highway and into the sewer. That shouldn't be going that. That should have its own pathway that involves land drainage going to streams and rivers, but not into the sewer network. We even have examples where we've got rivers and streams that are piped into the sewer network as a result of historic connections. And we'll look at some of those in a moment. But what we see, there are lots of reasons why other rainwater and slow response water is entering the sewer network. And one of the things we've all set out in our business plans going forward is how do we separate this rainwater and prevent it from mixing with sewage in the first place? And that way it won't discharge over storm overflows, it won't go into the rivers. But that actually takes quite a lot of work with partners and with nature-based solutions to separate that out. So that's one of the things we'd like to talk on and work our way through. And in a sense, some of these things were picked out a good few years ago when the Floods and Water Management Act was done in 2011. But one of the issues we're seeing is not all of the elements of the Floods and Water Management Act were enacted by government, and as a result that legislation doesn't exist at the moment in terms of managing some of these other pathways. So that's one thing we'd like to see as an industry brought forward and actually implemented, because it will really help with the ability to separate this water out. Could we move to the next slide, please? And what's the outcome? And we've already touched on this. Giles has just touched on. Is it bathing water quality we're dealing with, or is it environmental protection in terms of the rivers? And there are very different technical standards as to how you would deliver against bathing waters and how you would deliver against river and environmental quality. Now, on the left there, we see the River Dart, which has had 4 inland bathing water designations occur in the last few weeks. We've been working very closely with Friends of the Dart and other organisations in promoting that. And it's really great to see those designations come in place. We are now lining up our investment around storm overflows in that catchment in order to support those bathing waters. But we're not the only sources of pollution within the River Dart. And some of you may have seen on social media just yesterday, there was an event on the Dart which saw a lot of soil runoff from farmland go into the River Dart. Social media was very quick, as it always tends to do, to blame South West Water for that. But actually the EA investigation, which was very quick and prompt, actually identified that it was soil pollution from the farming community that had gone into the river and caused that pollution. So when we look at storm overflows and the investment that's going to be required to achieve bathing water standards in these rivers, it's going to be more than just what water companies need to do in order to achieve those standards, because there are many other sources of pollution on the river network that we need to consider. Moving on to the next slide. This is one of those things where you're going to learn something new today. And this is actually Bazalgette. And Bazalgette, actually, for those who don't know, actually built a sewer in Torquay as well. He didn't just build the sewers in in London. So he actually built some tunnel systems which were commissioned in 1878 at the grand cost of 65. Well, it was actually £69,496, 12 shillings and 5 pence, and that was completed and actually took all of the raw sewage in Torquay and also all of the rivers and all of the drainage in Torquay, and it then discharged it off a long sea outfall at what's known as Hope's Nose. When we look at that on the next slide and see where we are today, the Clean Sweep programme actually intercepted that tunnel system and actually then pumps it all the way around the bay and treats it at Brokenby Sewage Treatment Works, and then that discharges it to the river. But what we've now got is a number of rivers plumbed into a tunnel network. And why did Bazalgette do that? That's a question you're probably sat thinking. Well, at the time, those were probably highly polluted rivers and streams, and therefore they went into the tunnel system to protect public health. But today they're running clear. But we now continue to mix it with sewage. And actually one of the challenges we've now got is, well, how do we separate those rivers out? Because at the moment they do a 20-kilometre journey around the bay when they could go straight to the sea. And we pump that, and all of the energy and carbon associated with pumping that all the way around the bay, treating it before it discharges. So I'm very passionate about how do we get surface water out of the sewer network, and how do we then gain the benefits and the capacity so that we don't spill through storm overflows, and as a result we save carbon and we actually are in a much better place. So that's a real example that's out there today in Torbay. We move to the next slide, please. What we can then see is there are lots of other ways in which water can do it. One we see primary is that we see land runoff coming from farming land, particularly onto the highways, running down into gullies and then entering the sewer. We need to find alternative pathways. We need to work together with the local flood authorities, risk management authorities, to look at how do we separate that out, and how does we prevent that from actually combining with sewage in sewers, and actually keep, it's a strange phrase, keep sewers for sewage rather than for rainwater. Moving on to the next slide, please. And what do we see in terms of the response in those catchments? Well, you have the rainfall event. We've got a hydrograph here. And at the moment, what we see is you would see the initial runoff, which is quite rapid occurring, but then all of these other sources of rainwater entering the sewer. If we can move to the next slide, what we then see is we see a longer bit of the tail of the hydrograph run. So if we go to the next slide, please. And what we see is that rainfall continues, and then if we could go to the next slide again, what we then see is a really long tail for slow drain down that's occurring within the catchments, even though the rainfall had finished days before. And in some catchments, we're seeing that this can actually run for 12, 16 days as a result of this slow runoff occurring from these other sources. And that's not what sewers are designed for. Sewers are designed to actually see that. Now, as Giles said earlier, if we go build concrete tanks, those concrete tanks will get full very quickly. Whereas if we separate out at source and give it other pathways to pass through, what we will see is that water then never enters the sewer in the first place. So that's the design philosophy we want to work through. And within the Southwest, we've developed up our green first methodologies, whereby we consider these green separation solutions first before we consider the grey based tank concrete solutions. Moving on to the next slide. What we can see though is across England that plans have been put forward by all of the water companies, totaling a total of £10.2 billion over the next 5 years, alleviating over 9,000 overflows and reducing 150,000 spills. But as many people say, that isn't happening fast enough. and that isn't happening quick enough in accordance with the targets that have been put in place. We move to the next slide. We can talk a little about the South West Water plans. And in South West Water, we recognised that we needed to deliver those benefits earlier. We've set ourselves a challenge of completing those by 2040, 10 years ahead of the government target. And actually, what we've said is that we will deal with all bathing waters, all shellfish waters, and a large majority of the inland sensitive waters by 2030, completing all of those sensitive waters by 2035, but actually completing all the storm overflow improvements across the whole region, across over 800 overflows by 2040. And we're the only company that has set that out in our plans to achieve that by 2040. I think Severn Trent have pushed their plans to 2045, but most of the other companies are sat at 2050. Now, we'll wait and see what views are expressed in pace and delivery as we see our feedback from Ofwat in the next few weeks. But certainly for the South West, we recognised that we should try and deliver those as quickly as possible. And we've spoken with customers, if you can move to the next slide, about doing that. And they've come back and said what they'd like us to do is deliver green-based solutions first and foremost, and actually take that surface water out of the network and therefore reduce spills in that way, rather than spending lots of money on grey tanks to deliver that. So that's one of our elements within our Green First approach, which looks at the business processes and the decisions that we will make as a business as we deliver this programme over the next 15 years. Finally then, we're also looking at how do we use new technology. If we can move to the next slide, please. And the next one. And we launched back in March our WaterFit Live system, where you can see at the moment all of the coastal and bathing water discharges on EDMs are available within an hour. We are rolling that through additional phases over the coming months so that all EDMs will be visible through that approach. But we are concentrating in our next round around the new bathing waters that have been designated and getting those EDMs and that data visible for the new bathing waters. So all of that will be visible and our plans are visible for overflow by overflow on the National Storm Overflow Plan that is visible on Water UK's website. So a lot of time and effort and a lot of focus around separating that water out from the network and not having it mixing with sewage in the first place, so that actually we can then deliver the benefits everybody is seeking on bathing water, shellfish waters by 2030, and then all of the storm overflows by 2040. So at that point, I'll hand back to Nikki.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's great, just on time, perfect. Thank you, really interesting to hear. Lots of food for thought there as well. And Pete and I have been keeping an eye on your questions coming in and frantically scribbling a few down. There's some great ones already. Do keep them coming in. Obviously, we'll do questions after the break, after 11 o'clock. So we're going to keep things moving. So we've had a perspective from Surfers Against Sewage, from an ENGO. We've had a perspective from a water company. We're going to move now to hear from Claire Walsh. Claire is Professor in Water Security at Newcastle University. So Claire, a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So if we can get my slides up, that'd be great.
Oh, Claire's.
Okay, think I'm back, or somebody's back. Yeah, so we just move on to the first slide. We've already heard both Pete and Nikki make reference to this new report that's hot off the press by the Royal Academy of Engineering and the National Engineering Policy Council. So they've published this report called Testing the Waters, Priorities for Mitigating Health Risks from Wastewater Pollution. And this report actually examines some of the interventions that might be appropriate to reduce public health risks to people that are using waters for recreation that might be polluted with organisms from human waste. So this table here that we can see on the slide provides an overview of those interventions considered, and they've been categorised into 4 categories there: water management, wastewater treatment, monitoring, engagement, maintenance, and operations. And of course, all of those are important. But what this table is actually showing is the actual anticipated expenditure to actually implement some of these interventions versus the potential risk reduction to public health that they may bring. So if we just do a click, I want to focus. So just to click on the slide, I want to focus on those that are related to water management. So these, as we've just been hearing from Mark, some interventions that really seek to reduce the volume of water entering those combined sewers, to reduce the number of overflows and therefore the exposure to the hazard. And here we can see, you know, they look like they might do a good job, but the costs here are pretty high. And I argue that we can actually lessen those costs when we start thinking about the multiple benefits of those, and actually as we start to gain better data and evidence to actually recognise the performance that these interventions can bring. And on the next slide, the report also actually then starts to map these interventions against some of the public policies that they might contribute to, and that could either be positively or negatively. And we've heard already, like some of the various legislation that is around in England, and then if we add in the regulators as well, what we really do have is a complex picture of challenges and actors that are involved in the problem, and of course need to be involved in the solution as well. So moving on to the next slide, and just working through some of those water management options for as potential interventions there. So approximately still 20% of sewers are combined, and what we mean by sewer separation is reconfiguring existing single pipe into a two-pipe system that separates the foul and the surface water sewers. Then the wastewater goes off to the treatment plants, and then the surface water is then distributed back into the environment. So if we eliminate those storm overflows, then the surface water is still likely to increase, but the foul water would then be sort of undiluted, and the flow is perhaps then more predictable, improving the quality and efficiency of the treatment once it gets to the works. Of course, new housing developments all have hopefully all have separate systems, but they often then actually do then converge into a combined sewer further down in the network as well, which is a problem, obviously. So here in the tables that have been produced, we can see that there's some positive benefits in terms of perhaps related to ecology, but actually installing new systems where they really have this high embodied carbon, for example. So this is starting to look at some of those trade-offs there. On the next slide, there's we focus on sustainable drainage. So sustainable drainage systems that are mimicking natural processes, and their purpose really is to divert this surface runoff from entering into the sewers, perhaps providing a filter and conveying that water more slowly into watercourses, promoting infiltration into the soil and the ground along the way. And then providing those services of controlling the source of the water, conveying it, so slowing it down, perhaps filtering it, capturing it, might then also help with the degradation of pollutants that might be being transported into that water as well. And so we can start to recognise here some of those multiple benefits that a solution and intervention like this might bring. And perhaps the strongest one here is around that mitigation of surface water flood risk as well, particularly during extreme rainfall events. And then finally, the final solution that's in that list there is storage tanks. So on the next slide, so the purpose of these tanks are obviously temporary storage of that excess volume of wastewater from the combined sewer, rather than discharging directly into the water body. These are typically underground. I can find a picture of one underground, and obviously there we have great excavation costs and the disruption that might create to the environment. So perhaps not a good solution overall. And in addition, they may need to stop pumping that water to get it back into the sewer for when you're ready for it, and obviously cleaning as well when those things are empty. So moving on to the next slide then. So my argument is that perhaps some of the costs that are there in those tables, where it's saying the actual capital cost and the operational costs are high, are perhaps because we don't actually yet know or have that robust data or evidence to counter that argument. So one of the things that we've been doing at the National Green Infrastructure Facility, which is hosted at Newcastle University, is to try and add that data to that. And if you just click once more, there might be a little time-lapse video there to show something that we're doing in a greenhouse as well. So we have a setup where we have a swale and some ensembles and lysimeters that are doing a range of different experiments at scale to look at the impact that vegetation and different densities of that vegetation, different types of vegetation can have in performing some of those services, like slowing down and conveying and storing, filtering the water. We've also started to look at what the multiple benefits might be as well. So here we've been not just using typical rain garden vegetation, but also looking at food and herbs and whether they still have provide that same reduction in flows, and obviously creating an additional benefit of an urban food supply. Picture there of our wetland as well, which promoting biodiversity, and we're also looking at the possibility of capturing heat in such features as well. And of course, all around this is because this is a facility that's outdoors. It's on the campus. Great engagement opportunity with the public as well to share some of those findings, and we're running citizen science campaigns as well around that too. And then on the next slide, just another approach that we take is we've been thinking about how we model some of those reductions in surface water. So these are just some outputs from our flood model, our city cap model that we've developed here at Newcastle University, and colleagues have developed. And what we're showing here is that some of those traditional sustainable drainage features, such as converting impermeable surfaces into permeable surfaces, and perhaps using and encouraging people to install water butts or green roofs, trying to demonstrate where the reduction in that risk comes from a flooding perspective, but then also thinking about comparing the construction costs of those sorts of features versus the damage reduction costs in terms of exposure of buildings, damage to buildings, and thinking about how that differs between residential and commercial properties, but also thinking about what some of the indirect impacts might be on services, so disruption to transport networks and such. So it's about building that evidence for a different type of intervention related to water management to prevent that volume of water reaching the sewers in the first place. And then on the next slide, so how can we encourage that? How can we promote those interventions that relate to water management? Well, as I say, I think we need that evidence, that greater evidence, and facilities like the National Green Infrastructure Facility, because it's a long-term investment, allow us to monitor maintenance regimes of some of those interventions over time. Education in terms of making sure that these things are planned in and put in the first place, and then thinking about how we enable those, and that's where we need to start making those other arguments, if you like. And this graph here is just sort of thinking about if you were to use sustainable drainage systems, where would who would benefit from that? And it's not just when we think about it's not just the water, it's not just reducing the quantity of water, improving the quality of water. We are offering spaces that can be used in different ways, so for recreation and local pride, and improving the image of an area. And then when we start to think about how we finance these things, can we capture some of the value that's created for others, and then feed that into the financing or funding models. And then my final slide is just a plug for an event at the Northumbrian Waters Innovation Festival. I'm sure you've all heard about. So we're actually going to run a sprint on this topic in July in collaboration with Northumbrian Water to think about bringing all the relevant disciplines and stakeholders together to start thinking about how we can mitigate that impact that increased rainfall is having on the drainage systems and the environment. So yeah, please do join us for that and get involved. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Claire. Right, my brain is fizzing. I hope everybody else's is, and Pete and I are still frantically keeping up with the questions. So keep sending them in, and then you'll get a break, and we won't really. We'll just be doing the questions for 15 minutes. We've got one final keynote speaker, and I'm really delighted to welcome him. So Peter Hammond is joining us. Peter is one of the founders of Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, and we'll have 10 minutes hearing from him, and then we'll take a short break. What I would say though is people have asked if the decks can be shared after the event. So we'll check with our presenters, but I would imagine we'll do our very best, and there'll be a recording of the event shared as well afterwards. So a very warm welcome to you, Peter.
Thank you. And can you just hold your hand up? Oh, I can't actually see anyone. Just to confirm that you can see my slides.
I'll tell you in a second. I'm sure we will. Yes, we can. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Far away.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I am a campaigner with Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. And going last, of course, in the sequence of 4, the danger is that I'm going to repeat some of the things other people have said. I will touch on some of the things from the first talk, but I actually, being a mathematician by background, I'll delve in a little bit to some of the numbers and details. And actually, although the 3 previous speakers are what you might call active professionals in the water world, I'm not. My background is as an academic in computational biology, and I've been retired for 10 years. So why am I involved in this? Well, I live on the River Windrush. I hope you can see a picture. This is the River Windrush in my garden. The river runs through my garden and under the building I'm sitting in now because I live in a former converted mill. So this is the state of the river in 2017, when in 2019, it looked like this. So you can see there was an enormous deterioration, not just in the look of the river, but also in the animal life, the biodiversity of the river. And so I and my neighbour, Ashley Smith, started this organisation, WASP, Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, because we were very angry about the deterioration of our river, and we started to look into more and more detail about why this was happening. And like many people in the general public now who are also angry, I thought what I would do is to address this topic is to say, well, let's look at some of the things people are angry about and what might happen to improve that anger, lessen it, and what things are people not looking at. So my simple model of the water industry is that we pay the water industry to take our sewage and wastewater and to render it, as the phrase goes, harmless or relatively harmless before they return it to our seas and rivers. And over the last 30 years, unfortunately, as Giles hinted at, the water company have emphasized the fact that they can make enormous profits from this business. And so the question is it fair that, for instance, shareholders in the water world can get a 30% return on their investment when the rest of us only get 4 or 5% in the bank? And is it fair that people like Liv Garfield, the CEO of Severn Trent Water, can earn 3.2 million in 1 year in terms of pay, bonuses and shares? And what will Ofwat do about this? And of course, this is echoed across other companies as well. Well, I'm hoping, and there are signs that those sort of dividends and shares are going to be addressed. But actually, the real reason why we need change, of course, is that we are getting all these spills of untreated sewage into our rivers and seas. And Ofwat needs to, I think, remove those bonuses or make sure that they are related to the inversely proportional to the amount of sewage spill that's going out into our rivers and seas, and reduce the actual repayment of the share capacity of that goes back to shareholders. And actually, maybe we need to go even a step further and remove that and go back to the sort of thing that happens in municipal oversight of the sewage industry in places like Paris or whatever. And let's go for a not-for-profit organization where we take all the profit from the company and push it back into the actual management of the assets, the sewage works, the pumping stations that are supposed to be doing the job. Unfortunately, the water companies have sweated the assets now for 30 years, and we're in the situation we're in. Another issue that Giles mentioned is that we need more honesty from the water industry. And I want to give you two examples of what I would call dishonesty. Liv Garfield, when she was interviewed by the Environment Audit Committee in 2021, said this: "Do we have raw sewage spilling straight into rivers in the Severn Trent patch? Then no, we definitely don't. A month or two ago at Cannock Magistrates, Severn Trent were ordered to pay £2 million as a fine for raw sewage discharge into the River Trent." This is the phraseology used by the Environment Agency on their website, and this is what the public see. So a very different viewpoint from the CEO. Another quote from her interview with that committee, when she was asked about what was coming out of the storm overflows, she said, "Well, it's rainwater intermingled with some sewage that will probably have gone through some treatment process on the way." Well, that may be so, but what's not taken out are all the toxins, the drugs that we take and that get excreted, etc., etc. And one thing that is not really receiving enough attention, I think, is the microplastics. Now, in 2021, as a result of WASP's evidence to the Environment Audit Committee, they were so impressed, they brought the whole committee to our village, and we stood in our garden and we explained to them what was happening to our river. And we also invited Jamie Woodward, who's on the right in this picture, who's an expert on microplastics. And you will know that he's found that the 95% of microplastics that are taken out by sewage treatment, when we have untreated sewage spills into the rivers, it gets into the silt, it's taken up by the invertebrates and the fish, then it gets washed out to sea and it's taken up by marine mammals. But microplastics are a much worse insidious contaminant. So we're now finding microplastics in bodies, in people's bodies. So, for instance, cadavers that are being used in medical research. Just last week, it was found that in the testes of some of those male volunteers who've donated their bodies to science, there were microplastics. Microplastics become nanoplastics. They can cross the placenta. They've been found in the first stool of newborn babies called meconium. So a woman exposed who's pregnant will be exposing her unborn fetus. And if that unborn fetus is female, it will have the eggs that will produce the grandchildren at some point in the future. So potentially a woman being exposed to microplastics could be, if she's pregnant with a female fetus, be exposing her grandchildren. We also are very angry about the poor regulation we get from the Environment Agency, and in Wales, of course, it's the Natural Resources Wales. And the question is, why is it that people like us in WASP have to expose all this illegal activity of unpermitted spills of untreated sewage to our rivers and seas? So the agency announced a detailed examination of water companies, an investigation in 2021, but we're still waiting for an announcement about the outcome of that. Meanwhile, WASP and other people have been exposing what the industry is doing. And we do this by analysing in a lot of detail what is happening at the sewage works, for example. Here's an example from Severn Trent's Alvechurch sewage works, where by looking at the detailed sewage flow, when spills occur, we can actually identify compliant spills here on the left and non-compliant and hence illegal spills here on the right. Now, to do that, you need to have access to a lot of detailed information about the treated sewage and what's coming out as untreated. So you need data transparency. In fact, you need to put a freedom of information type request into a water company called an Environmental Information Regulation Request, an EIR, to get the data. Now, since 2021, when the agency announced its big investigation, lots of the companies have slowly starved us, campaigners, of the data. So at the moment, for example, only Thames, Wessex and Welsh Water routinely provide the detailed treatment and spill data, whereas Anglian, Northumbrian, Severn Trent, Southern, Southwest, United and Yorkshire refused to produce the data. And without that data, we cannot check the compliance with permits that are issued by the agency to these sewage treatment works, etc. However, that is about to change, or it has already started changing. A month ago, Steve Lavelle up in the northeast has had a landmark announcement from a tribunal court, a higher court, after he requested Northumbrian Water to give him some data. They refused to give it. He appealed, as you do, within the company, and 2 months later they confirmed they still wouldn't give him the data. He went to the Information Commissioner's office and asked them if they would force the companies to give the data, and they found in favor of the company. Steve then went to something called the First Tier Tribunal General Regulatory Chamber Information Rights, and sounds Dickensian, doesn't it? And they found in favor of Steve. And so they told the Information Commissioner, they rapped their knuckles, said, no, you're wrong, and Northumbrian must give the data within 35 days. Now, it could be that having their knuckles rapped, the Information Commissioner now seems maybe to have changed their mind. So last week, they agreed with the appeal of the Sunday Times that United Utilities now must give them the data. So the law is coming to the to help us get the data that we need to do this compliance checking, etc., the job that the agency should be doing. Now, I put this slide in. This is not to do with CSOs and untreated sewage. This is about the operator self-monitoring method that is used in the water industry, where water companies test the treated sewage. Now, why have I mentioned this? Well, WASP has evidence that in order to try and reduce the number of spills coming out of sewage works, some water companies are pushing more sewage through their works more quickly to avoid a spill. Now, that means, and we have the evidence, that the quality of the effluent that's coming out is not up to scratch. And I've got an example here just to show you how that can come about. So here's an example of the 12 spot monthly samples that Thames Water did at Carterton Sewage Works of their final treated effluent. This is showing the ammonia values on 12 occasions. On the horizontal axis is actually the time of day when these tests were undertaken. The dotted line is the what's called the 95% permitted level, and you can breach, this sewage works could breach that dotted line, that level, a couple of times in 12 months. Now you can see they're well below that, but I was fascinated by the fact that the effluent is only being tested between about 7 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I looked at DEFRA's website and I downloaded 27,000 sample data. And I found that actually the time of day when right across the industry these tests are made forms a similar sort of pattern, 90% being between about 8 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, those of you who work in the water industry or have studied it will know that sewage is generated in terms of 2 peaks. The first peak is in sort of the middle of the day, and we can see that is being monitored. The second peak is not being monitored. In fact, less than half the sewage that is ever treated is monitored for its quality against its permit. Should we be worried about that? What is happening outside these times? Well, it turns out that Thames Water also have what they call continuous SON measurement every 15 minutes of their final effluent. And we used an EIR to get that data. And when we overlaid it on the spot testing, that is, the once a month testing, this is what we got. So in other words, the actual ammonia levels are breaching the permit in the late afternoon and the evening and in the early hours of the morning at this particular works. And we found evidence of this across, I found it across the industry, across about 200 different sewage works. So I'm going to finish there by saying what I would like to see is the profit motivation taken out of the water industry for treating sewage. I want the regulators to step up to the mark better than they have been doing, and I'm hoping that some of you who will become the sort of hydro engineers of the future will think of ways of improving some of the technology, like the SONs I was just mentioning, which we know are not always reliable. the EDM, the event duration monitors that are used to actually record the spills, to make these things more reliable and more accurate, so that we can actually do better monitoring of the water industry. And I'll stop there.
One for me anyway. I don't know about you, Pete, because what it started to do was broaden the debate out, and actually some of the questions that have been coming through have been exactly that. Well, actually water plays a role, agriculture plays a role, highways plays a role. So plenty for us to think about here at the systems level, as well as specifically focusing in on sewage and water companies. So great to see so many questions. I'm hesitant to say keep sending them in, but do keep sending them in. I mean, that is our job, isn't it, really?
Yes.
So keep sending them in. We are going to take a 15-minute break. We're going to stick to time. So we'll be back with you at 11:15. We'll be joined by 3 more panelists, and I'll get them to introduce themselves at the start of the session. And we'll do our best to moderate and keep an eye on questions. So don't feel like you can't send one in once we've started. So go and get yourself a cup of tea or whatever your tipple is at 11 o'clock in the morning or wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you at 11:15. Thank you. Well, welcome back. I hope you've managed to get yourself a drink. You're feeling suitably refreshed. Pete and I both had some bananas, so that should get us through the next hour, all being well. We are about to start a masterclass in multitasking, she says optimistically. We'll do our very best. If we don't get to your question, I'm really sorry. And what I would say, and I was just reflecting in the break, is that the chat is brilliant. There is a whole raft of interesting conversation, people answering each other's questions in there. So if you're watching this live and you can access the chat, go and have a look, as well as listening to the answers, because there's some great stuff going on in there. So if we don't get to your question, I am very sorry, we're slightly overwhelmed, but we've done our best to group as much as we possibly can. So before we get in, we are joined by 3 new panelists, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in turn in a moment, tell us a very brief bit about who they are and what their interest is in this topic, and then we'll get straight into the first question. So let's begin with Tom Stevenson. So Tom, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, in fact, I think I've got Philippa on my screen. Let's keep Philippa.
Oh.
Philippa, why don't you go first?
Hi, okay, I can go. I was expecting Tom to go. So I'm the WIRE representative. So Pete, as Pete suggested at the beginning, WIRE is a C2C for PhD students. I'm one of the PhD students that it's been funded. My piece of water infrastructure is CSOs. The resilience is actually the rivers, so the environmental harm caused by CSOs. So what my project looks at essentially is what has the decision looked like for the last 30 years around CSOs? What data has been available to water companies, consultancies to make those decisions? What's the quality of that data? How does the quality of that data then impact what decisions made? So when they were talking about sort of solutions, how does our understanding of the problem mean what the size of the solutions that are required? Does that limit like the use of suds? Does it promote tanks and then the carbon context? Is there other sort of solutions that can be put in place as well? Like how do we use our sewer network? When are we using our sewer network? When are we putting on that dishwasher? Are we putting that on in the middle of heavy rain, etc.? And so that's kind of, I look at the environment side, I might focus on the environment side, but I also look at all of those economic decisions. So where do I sit on CSOs? I guess is what you'd want to know. I am.
Well, before you come to that,
Obviously.
Philippa, I think we'll come back to you in a second because I'm going to put that question to everybody if that's okay. Also, I'm glad you got 4 years for a PhD because that is not a small amount of work to do. Oh my goodness. Let's throw to Tom next if that's okay. We'll get Tom to introduce himself and then we'll come to Karen and then we'll get stuck in and we'll find out exactly where you all are on CSO. So Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Well, I'm at the opposite end of my career to Philippa. I'm a professor of water sciences at Cranfield University. I'm semi-retired, so you should know that a couple of my other interests, so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm an ambassador for British Water, which is the trade association for supply chain companies to the water sector. So I'm supporting many small companies and large companies across the UK. And I'm also a director of a company that manufactures package sewage treatment plants, which is an interest of mine because I don't have the privilege, like the majority of you in this room, of being connected to a sewer and sending my wastewater to a utility company for treatment. I have to have a treatment plant in my back garden, which I wouldn't wish on anybody.
Tom, off-grid living, lovely, lovely, brilliant, great, thank you. And last but by no means least, Karen, could you introduce yourself for us, please?
Hi there, I'm Karen Shackleton, from a founder member of Ilkley Clean River Group. We were the first river in the country to achieve bathing water status, and we're currently helping other groups around the country successfully apply for their status as well. And we also have secured about £70 million upgrade in our sewage treatment works at Ilkley as a result of our efforts. And we also set up a citizen science project measuring levels of E. coli pollution along the whole length of the wharf, involving interested and concerned communities along the whole length of the wharf from the source to the ooze.
Great, thank you, Karen. Wonderful. So lovely to have everybody with us. We've got a great panel, as you can see, and covering a wide range of interests and backgrounds. So we'll do our very best to put them some challenging questions to them. So let's begin. Our first question, and we're going to come to Tom first, is can we make CSOs more acceptable and reconcile their role in managing wastewater? So a nice, easy one to start with. So Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, as ever, as an academic, I'll probably twist your question a bit, Nikki. I'm not sure that they will ever be made felt as acceptable by the general public, because I mean, there's so much emotion around it. We hear it. Most newspapers report sewage spills rather than combined sewer overflow spills. So I think that's going to be difficult to reconcile. I think the main thing is, we see lots of data about how many hours of spills there are. As an engineer, I'd like to know the flow and the load, because it's going to take time to tackle the problem. So, the usual Pareto principle that sort of probably 80% of pollution comes from 20% of CSOs. So we need to be, and I know that the utility companies will be onto that, tackling the big issues first. What is unacceptable, though, is combined sewer overflow spills during dry weather, and those are unacceptable. And there's no doubt that the sector, water utilities, have been slow to tackle that. But I'm afraid I know that Chris called for quick action in his talk. It's going to take time, I'm afraid, folks. Mark mentioned Bazalgette bringing the sewer to Torquay in Victorian times. Well, the sewer was only brought to Cranfield Village in 1947. So it took a long time to get coverage of the whole country, even at a time when arguably Britain may well have been a richer country. And there is still 5% of the population who are not on a main sewer. You know, I might argue that I'd like to be connected to a sewer, and I'd like somebody else to pay for it. But is that the best way of spending our money? So I think we're going to have to deal with combined sewer overflows over the kind of time spans that the utility companies have mentioned. And it will cost money. And I'll leave it there because I'm sure the money question will come up.
Yeah, that's absolutely next. Thank you, Tom. Right, let's ask the same question to Philip, if that's okay, because I'm conscious I cut you off in your prime. So that same question, can we make CSOs more acceptable, and how do we reconcile their role, if possible, within wastewater management?
I think one of the things to make them more acceptable, I agree with Tom, I don't think they'll ever be completely accepted, but is that sort of, it was said a couple of times in the presentations that CSOs were meant as a safety valve. And when safety valves are tripped, you should be thankful that the safety valve was there, even if you're not happy that the safety valve was tripped. Because if CSOs didn't exist, we'd have an increase of flooding in our lowest point of the networks, and that could be somebody's houses, that could be your work, it could be a school, and we just don't have the sort of the capacity in our health system to have stagnant sewage in our communities, especially because we should lead to likely deaths of the sort of over 60s with chronic conditions or the under 5s, and we don't really get that currently in the media coverage about like the number of deaths caused by our sewage network. It's sort of illnesses and long and chronic conditions formed. So a sort of more of exceptional sort of that yes, we're in a bad position, but we could also be in a much worse position.
Interesting. Thank you, Philippa. And I think we'll get on to certainly the debate around public health versus environmental health in a minute. It's really interesting to have a conversation about public health, I think, Pete, isn't it?
Absolutely.
When it is about wastewater, actually, it's less talked about. So thank you for bringing that up, Philippa. So let's head to Karen and ask the same question. So Karen, what's your view? Can we make CSOs more acceptable? Can we reconcile their role in managing wastewater? Oh, Karen, would you mind just doing that again for us, if that's okay? I can't hear you. Everybody else might be able to, but I don't want to miss a trick.
I'm a realist, and I do accept that combined sewage overflows are acceptable in periods of genuine exceptional rainfall conditions. They're not acceptable as an excuse to compensate for underinvestment in the sewerage work and to save water companies money. And you know, less than a handful of times a year, maybe so, but we got results, and our single CSO was operating over 150 times in a year, amount of hours equating to 110 days of sewage in that time. So 120 days a year of sewage going into our river is not exceptional. So that's what my stance on that would be.
Yeah, no, thank you. And actually, we saw some questions in the chat about what do we mean by exceptional circumstances. So if any of our panelists want to pick that up, that would be excellent as we go through. I'm going to hand over to Pete, and we're going to pick up one of the first audience questions.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so we're going to talk then a little bit about finances, because we've had a number of questions come through on how the sector is financed, particularly in England, and how that differs from the other companies in the UK, and how that has potentially caused problems. So I'm going to firstly sort of tee up Claire perhaps to answer this first, and then we'll go around other colleagues. So the point's been raised that potentially privatisation has caused underinvestments, obviously dividends being drawn out, but Scotland and Wales have potentially similar problems with respect to CSOs and discharges from CSOs they have very different funding models. Okay, so is it the fact that we just don't pay enough for upgrading our infrastructure? So is that the root cause, or is it down to the specific funding model that we have in England around the privatisation? So perhaps Claire, could I ask you to kick us up with that one?
Yeah, I think, well, thanks, Pete. I think it's probably a bit of both, isn't it? I think our infrastructure systems are getting older. They were designed for populations of the time and development levels of the time, and that investment and upgrade has just not kept up. Possibly because of the other sort of pressures on that profit that might be coming into the water companies. But I think we do have the opportunity now, though, to think about that differently with the current pressure coming from the public, the investment that has been set aside to think about not only the water system. I think we've touched on this a little bit before, but what are the interactions with some of our other infrastructure systems as well? So if we think about where some of those other other sources of pollution are coming from, in terms of highways, for example, can we start to leverage more than one infrastructure system here to try and make some of those improvements?
Thank you, Claire. Okay, so perhaps we could just go back to our other panelists to see if anyone else would like to add to that discussion point. Perhaps inviting maybe Giles or Peter to add to that.
Yeah, I'm very happy to come in on this. You're absolutely right. There isn't a water system ownership model and financing model that is delivering fantastic environmental outcomes and great its ability to look after public health and human health. There isn't. So you are right to say that with the multiple models we have, it's not really working. But the thing is, with a privatized system, the privatized system that we have, it was originally privatized to encourage greater investment in environmental outcome. Okay, so we thought this was a way to get private capital to drive a lot of this, and investment could be made, and that would be a good thing. Unfortunately, what has happened is the system has been captured over time, and the focus of the system has been to generate profits for private investors. Okay, so the system itself has been used, it's been leveraging the consistent income to water companies of customer bills. They're pretty much, when they're coming in, how the volume of money that's coming in, and that's been securitized, so sold on, if you like, and geared up, which means taking debt against that secure income. That debt could and should have been used to really drive massive environmental improvement. But what happened is, over time, and with a pressure to keep bills down, a lot of that income went out of this system, as Peter really beautifully put in his simple model. Absolutely, it went out to private shareholders. So private shareholders had taken a lot out of this system. So privatization, with that leakage of capital, if you like, cannot deliver the best environmental improvements. Maybe what we need to do, though, is not think about whether it's private versus national. We need to think smarter about the roles that different players in this system can play to produce the outcomes that we want. So how do we incentivize the right type of capital? That's long-term, patient capital that accepts a lower return on investment, because these are utility. This is infrastructure that is safe and secure. We're always going to need clean water supply. We're always going to need to treat our wastewater. So there will always be income out of this system from us paying customer bills. So it's not a risky, it's not like something that needs kind of risk-based finance to go for. It's a low risk sort of thing. So this should be perfectly suitable for pension funds and long-term investors. We need the rules to incentivize that, whilst maintaining, customer bills don't get hit with this. But we've also got to accept as a society that we need a new relationship around how we finance water and who owns it and that kind of thing, because it isn't currently working, and the public want change. So I think we need to think about innovation in the sort of social and financial systems around this.
Thank you. Mark, I think you've got your hand up to respond to that.
Yes, thanks. There is quite a multitude, and there are lots of different opinions about privatized companies, shareholders, whether it's publicly listed, securitized, etc., and what the returns are. If I can just make a couple of points. One, there are very different models around the UK, and different companies are on different journeys. So, for instance, in Scotland, very few of the EDMs are currently monitored. The pace of delivery within Wales is very different on the storm overflows compared with England. And so each area has a different story it's telling around its journey and its improvements in the pace of delivery. So when people say, oh, it's much better in Scotland, well, actually, things aren't being measured to the same degree in Scotland. And that's a program they're working on, and they're looking to install the EDMs. But at the moment, the data isn't comparable. When we come to shareholders and dividends, I think what people need to recognise is that we have to borrow money as water companies in order to fund the investment programmes. And we do that in two ways. One is through debt, where we go and we take loans out over 25 years and we pay that back with interest, because actually that's what a bank will require. And the second is through borrowing through equity, which is shareholders. Now, in South West Water's term, those shareholders are generally things like the pension funds that we've just seen mentioned by Giles, but also it's about customers. 1 in 14 of the customers and the shareholders we have in the Southwest is actually a customer of South West Water. So these are genuine people who are putting money into those investments, and they want a return on that. Otherwise, they will take their money out and they will go get that from a bank or somebody else. So dividends are paid to provide a return on the investment that is being provided through equity and through shares. So when we talk about shareholder dividends being paid, it is actually paying people for the money they are loaning the business to go and make those investments. So that's the basis of which dividends are being paid. The larger financial institutes and the securitized elements that are associated with some of the other companies, I can understand the issues around that. But particularly for those that are listed on the stock market, it is very much those institutional investors we're talking about in terms of pension funds and so forth that are supporting the investment that is required to meet these improvements.
Thanks, Mark. I think, Tom, you had your hand up to add to that.
Yeah, I think Giles makes a good point. I mean, Norman Fowler, who was one of the architects of privatisation, was recently interviewed on Radio 4 and actually he said that sort of the model of having shareholders, he said that should have been stuck to, and the regulator didn't have the powers to change that. So that's all sort of the kind of the history side. Personally, I don't think it's useful attacking the CEOs of these companies. I'm happy that they're well paid because they're protecting millions of people and public health and protecting the environment. We pay entertainers far more money and nobody seems to complain about it. So and for those people who are sort of coming into the industry is a really good industry to work in because you are actually helping to protect the environment. And I think the vilification of individuals doesn't help in the debate overall, personally. I also I'd like to widen it a little bit in that it's not just the fault of the shareholders. We've heard earlier from Peter talking about the Environment Agency, Ofwat. I mentioned that I was involved with British Water. I chaired the trade association. British Water has been talking to the regulator ever since privatisation about the model of having a 5-year price cap. That has clearly not worked. I've got plenty of newspaper headlines from the past about sort of bills going down 2 years after there were headlines about our decrepit sewage system. So that was 1995 and 1997. So, I mean, 'twas ever thus in some respects. So in terms of the finance, I mean, all of us in this room who pay water bills, we just haven't been paying enough for 30 years, let alone the dividend argument to finance it. I can remember 1989 and privatisation. And if you like, the real reason for privatisation, as Mark said, was to get money to invest to stop us pouring raw sewage into the sea, was just one good example where there's been great success. So I agree with Giles that you be careful what we wish for in terms of having water. We had water authorities that were wonderful public bodies, between 74 and 1989, and they didn't do the job. So, we just have to think carefully about how the sector is financed, and we're all going to have to pay a little bit more if we want some of the outcomes that we've heard about today.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Before we move on to the next question, are there any other of our panelists who want to add a few final quick comments to that? I can see Philippa has got a hand up, so go, Philippa.
So yeah, I just also wanted to widen it maybe a little further, because so far the discussion has just been on the UK and how we regulate. But if you actually look at sort of across the world, there are CSOs across the world. This is a problem. There is risk to public health and the environment. And you can see across Europe that different funding systems are still having similar issues with sort of aging systems and sort of not being able to fund the solutions required. And then you can even see, as sort of other countries have developed sewage systems after us, you can see that they are ramping up into following sort of our trajectory of sort of getting into these problems. So just because, and they all have different sort of economic systems. So just sort of that understanding that we can sort of see other case studies of other economic models, and some, you might argue that there might be slight differences, but some of the problems that we would still be seeing either way, even if 1989 hadn't happened.
Thank you, Philippa. Some really good comments there from you. Thanks. Okay, so I think we'll then move on to our next question. So, Nikki.
Yeah, some big stuff already. You know, system change. Do we need system change? A few of you have mentioned that, which is really interesting. Another theme that we've seen a lot of is questions about what are our rivers and seas for? Who are they for? Really, quite an emotive question. Some of you, I think, might have been intentionally writing some quite, challenging statements, like rivers are not swimming pools. I've seen it in the chat, but it's a really interesting point, really, isn't it? Around who are we investing, or what are we investing for in our systems? And so that's kind of the point I want to put to our panelists. Really, are we investing for environmental health? Are we investing for public health? So that's my big question, really. Who fancies taking that first? In fact, Giles, can I come to you first, if you wouldn't mind? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Who and what are we investing for?
So we absolutely need to invest for both, right? It shouldn't be a binary choice. Why would it be a binary choice? The people who go in the water, if you like, are the canaries in the coal mine, right? They are indicators. They provide us with indicators of whether the water quality is good, because if it's good for us, it'd be better for the environment. It is. I take the point that it feels a little bit of a luxury, perhaps. Is that what the swimming pool comment was meant to be?
Well, I suspect probably, yeah.
And I would disagree. Like, many of our places, they're loved by people because they love them, because they are healthy, and they should be places we go to restore from mental health and physical health, right? But more foundational, they are the essence. They underlie our economies in coastal communities, in inland communities where rivers run through them. If these places are treated as open sewers, it will undermine the economy in those places. People won't want to live there. They won't want to work there. Tourists won't want to go spend their money there. So to ignore those factors is to ignore the fact that, you know, this is really vital in terms of future economic performance, especially with climate change and biodiversity loss and all these other factors we can layer on, so accelerating environmental degradation. So I would say it's absolutely important that we look at a more holistic set of indicators around water quality health, which can indicate whether it's somewhere is safe to go into as a human being or an animal, as well as for its own sake as the environment. So I would certainly advocate for a much smarter set of indicators. And by the way, our current system under the bathing water regulations and others, it is pretty dumb. We look only at a specific set of indicators. So E. coli and enterococci as target monitoring that we look at to look at overall water quality health. We don't test for new viruses, for antimicrobial resistant bacteria, microplastics that Peter really brilliantly talked about and brought to life. Then a whole set of emerging and future threats, both to public health, but also to the environment. So we've got to get better at looking at those and smarter at looking at those. And by the way, there's a clear link as well between water quality and resilience in relation to tackling climate change as well. So seagrass beds offshore are being degraded by poor water quality. Seagrass is an amazing carbon sink. It's going to be one of the things we really rely on if we can nurture these areas and look to recover them, because they are more effective at sequestering carbon than terrestrial systems like rainforest. So we can say, okay, we won't swim in them. We're going to let the water be a bit more polluted. We'll use the rivers to disperse, pollution. But in doing so, there are unintended consequences for other aspects that are going to affect the future of this planet and survivability for humans. So let's treat them with respect. Let's put in the investment that's required, and we'll probably be a lot better off for many co-benefits.
Great, thank you, Giles. Interesting. So both is the answer to my binary question, which I'll let you off with. And I understand absolutely why you're saying that. Would any of our panelists like to come in and just respond to what we've heard Giles say, or on the question I posed, really? Claire, go for it.
Yeah, I'd perhaps just like to add to what Giles is saying there, in terms of one of the core concepts of environmental health is environmental justice, and unfortunately, a lot of our inner city urban rivers are already exposed to other different types of pollution, often some quite obvious things related to solid waste and rubbish disposal. And I think if we start looking at that data where those storm overflows are occurring, that they are sort of in the same places, sort of exacerbating that problem. So I think we need to start thinking about that concept of environmental health as well.
Great, thank you, Claire. Lovely. Anyone else want to respond? I thought this would elicit a massive response. Thank you, Pete. Go for it. Yeah.
Me, yes.
Yes,
okay.
Please. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really worried about the difference, the way we're treating, swimmers and paddlers, etc., and the environment. Because after all, the environment is exposed to treated sewage, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Swimmers will go in occasionally and get exposed. I mean, obviously they can be at risk if there's untreated sewage going in. But think of the animal life. It's their home. I've been a water vole surveyor for 10 years on the rivers in West Oxfordshire, and for a variety of reasons, their numbers are going down. But when you're standing by the river, you just realise that the animal life is exposed to the treated sewage and the occasional amount of untreated sewage throughout their lives, whereas swimmers and others can, for instance, can now look at a map and an online map and decide, oh, there's been a spill, I'm not going to go down to the river today or whatever, but the environment is getting it all of the time.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Mark, do you want to come in as a final one on this one? And then we're going to move on to a question about sort of data and EDMs, but we'll come back to source control, certainly. So, Mark.
I completely agree with Giles's view that we've got to get the balance right between standards to achieve bathing waters and where people are bathing, because of the economic benefits associated with those, and the standards for the environment. And the standards for bathing water are much tighter than those for the environment. But at the same time, we're not expecting the bathing water areas to have safe, clean drinking water to be treated to the same standards as drinking water would be, because actually if we did treat to those standards, there would be harm to the environment. So we've got to find that real balance between those two things. I mean, one debate I often hear would be, well, actually, if we're looking for clean, bathing, safe areas, actually the water company should take over all of the municipal swimming pools and let people go swim there for free. But actually that wouldn't be tackling the environmental impacts. And those are the things that we need to work through and find that balance between these standards. We are given guidance through things becoming classified as bathing water areas, and that there are standards that are distinctly different for those areas than there are for the generality of the environment and the rivers. So those are the standards that we're all working towards. We're all looking at how do we deliver against those standards. There are new standards coming from Europe with revised versions of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive coming as well. And we've got to see, as those are brought into UK legislation, how do they apply and in what way will they be done? But this debate between the environment or bathing waters, it probably isn't binary, and we need to provide bathing water standards where there are bathing waters, and we need to apply all the other environmental standards elsewhere. Can we afford to do all of that? Well, that's what we're all working towards and looking at how do we do that in the most efficient way.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. So we're going to come back to source control though in a minute. So for those questions in the chat around highways and agrig and other types of runoff, don't worry, we haven't forgotten you. But I'm going to hand over to Pete, and we've got some questions about data.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so we've had a number of points come through in relation to data and the fact that very quickly the water sector has installed the EDM monitoring on pretty much all of the CSO outflows. But I've got a question to the panel really around that data, that information, and Tom has already alluded to the fact that we're not currently looking at flows from these monitors. So what do we do with that data? How do we use it? The fact that the public will also have access to that information. So I'd like to perhaps throw that one out to the panel. Does anybody like to take that one up first? Tom, would you like to just build on your points around that?
Yeah, I will. I mean, you know, there's a lot of articles about sort of this. So, I mean, the I newspaper in particular has been focusing a lot of attention on this. And, you know, I should sort of say, obviously, as somebody who's lifelong been an academic in the field, this is fantastic. We've got lots of attention, which might mean lots of research money coming along the way. So thank you very much to everybody. But I mean, it sort of talks about 29 million. So the River Avon in Bath, it says 29,973.58 hours. Wow. Of sewage spilled in 2023 across 215 locations. What that doesn't say is what the quality was of those sewage spills. What proportion of those spills actually had sewage in it, and what the total flows were. I mean, that's the information we need, you know, because we've talked a lot about the past at the moment. If we're going to go forward about sort of some of the schemes like Mark talked about, you know, how do you separate out the rivers from the combined sewer system? That requires some thought, investment. At what points can you have the most impact with your money? And so I think the EDM data has raised the issue, but I think we need to go beyond that and sort of then. And I know that the utility companies, I'm sure Mark will be able to sort of say, are looking at which are the worst spills? Where are we spilling currently when there's not much rain? You know, when are we spilling when it's first flush rather than later on during a storm? Because it is going to take time. And so I'd like to sort of, it'd be nice to sort of see a bit more out there in the press about sort of tackling those big issues, because that's where we'll get best value for money and best value for the environment and for bathing.
Thanks, Tom. So I think we have Mark, then Giles. So Mark first, please.
Hi there. So let's understand what EDMs are. EDMs are actually just measuring the height of the discharge above the weir in the majority of cases. So there isn't a flow measurement. It is purely about, is it discharging and how long is it above the weir? So a lot of the data that people see, there's a huge belief that we've all got flow data and we're hiding that data. Flow data does exist at treatment works, and it has been measured, and that's part of what the EA call the MCERTS approach. And so in those occasions, there is flow data and there is EDM available. But out there in the network, it is just the height data and the EDM that's associated with that. So what are we doing about that as an industry, and what does the Environment Act asks us all to do? So we're all now in the process of, and it's part of all of our business plans going forward, that we're installing river water quality monitors upstream and downstream of every storm overflow discharge and treatment works to look at what are the quality parameters in the river. And this goes back to Tom's point of, do we understand the load? Do we understand what it's occurring? And it's not just the load from the discharges, but it's also what is the river doing at that moment in time in terms of flow? Because usually when discharges are occurring, the river is in spate, and actually the dilution effect of A, what's come through the sewer, and then B, what's discharging into the river, and the river itself is in spate and is in full flow. So what the river monitors will tell us is what is the water quality in the river as that discharge is occurring. And that data is required to A, be collected, and it's going to take 10 years to roll those monitors out across England. And we are talking tens of thousands of new monitors going in the rivers to actually measure those impacts. And that data is then required to be put into the public domain so everybody can see that. Now, having seen the data and having the data, there is going to be a real challenge in understanding that, because it's an incredibly complex set of parameters, and the way they interact is quite significant. So there's a huge learning curve associated with that, and we're going to have to go through that journey together to actually understand what does that mean and how does that actually inform decisions about what will occur. But that data is measuring everything in the river, so we will also see effects from other third parties, agricultural discharges, and other things in that data as well. So it won't just be the water quality data from water companies, it will be a whole host of any pollutant loads that are entering the rivers. And that's going to really open the door to try and understand all of those pollutants and how do we reduce those effects. So lots of data coming. It's going to take 10 years to get it there, but it is going to be incredibly vital to understand what the impact is.
Thanks, Mark. I think we'll just go to Karen first, because she's been patiently with her hand up, and then we'll come to Giles, and I think Peter's then got a final comment. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you. We shouldn't assume when these CSOs are operating that the river is in spate, because obviously we've got problems with over abstraction of our rivers now, and also when you get a sudden thunderstorm after a long period of dry weather, the rivers are very, very low, and the IWARF testing that I mentioned earlier in my introduction showed very clearly that when this happens, the E. coli levels are very high, and this is the only way that we can monitor these things. We recorded E. coli levels hundreds of times higher than bathing water standards. And so I just wanted to make that point, that we can't assume that this is just happening in a river in spate where it is diluted. And at the end of the day, a very wise man said dilution is not a source. It's not an excuse for pollution.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Sorry, a bit nervous.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, Giles.
Yeah, thank you. So for me, data is at the heart of what a lot of this system, or how the system is broken, right? Data and knowledge around the state of our rivers and the state of our seas is power. And I'll be really honest, the have done an awful lot to obscure the data, to make it difficult to access, make it very difficult to interpret, and put out a lot of misinformation around how the data in relation to water quality. There's a very exclusive club about whose data is acceptable, whose data is not acceptable. Citizen science is downgraded. People's own experience of being in pollution or seeing pollution is put to one side quite often. Data is at the heart of a lot of the arguments between, or that requires verification, and so there's a lot of contested practice between the water companies, the self-monitoring, and the EA and their verification. And so it's not, so power is at the heart of this. For me, it comes to life in as much as for water users, Surfers Against Sewage have an app called the Safer Seas and Rivers Service. It's the only real-time place you can go to see the impact of spills and discharges on water quality, and to know whether it's safe to go in the water or not. The data that is behind that app comes from the water company, and it doesn't come easily. We have to absolutely drag it out of the water companies to get it from them. And now the water companies are in a project to voluntarily, and this is good, but with a longer term regulatory deadline, put more data into the public domain. But they are using this to dump data out there and reduce the lack of clarity of what's really going on. So yes, we're going to have a lot more information around EDM, event duration monitoring out there, and whether CSOs are firing or not. But what's being reduced here is clarity that keeps the clarity of the actual situation that keeps people safe and give them knowledge about the quality of the environment. So it is phenomenal that in 2024, the only thing we can do is put data out there, which is about the height of water, and whether it's firing or not, when in other sectors, we are looking at very smart, very advanced data that can be tracking all sorts of environmental indicators from satellite, and with dispersed technologies and citizen science playing a massive role in really understanding these systems. So I think we just have got to be clear-eyed about the fact that data is at the heart of a lot of what is wrong, who holds that data, how they use it, and the fact that innovation just has not been applied as it should to data in this sector. So things are becoming murkier in many respects rather than clearer.
Okay, thank you. We'll have Peter, then Philippa, if we could make your comments relatively concise, please. Thank you.
I'd like to address two things: the granularity of the data and the accuracy. So until recently, the EA, for example, was just counting the number of spills in a year and the total hours, when actually to apply the rules about legal and illegal spilling, you actually need all the detail. So they've actually been looking at the data through a telescope, not a microscope, which is what WASP was always doing. And that is changing, I assume. Now they're looking into water companies in detail. On the accuracy, I agree with Tom. We should be measuring volume. And in Scotland, they do give out data on volume, actually. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but they do that. And Thames Water had a volume meter on its Mogden works, that serves 2 million people. And I noticed recently they've taken that offline, so they don't actually publish that data. The flow meters have been around for decades, and they are now, they're inserted and they're pretty accurate. I've just looked at data for 150 sewage treatment works for one company, and I've looked at the flow data and the EDM data, and the flow data is not consistent always with the EDM data. The EDM data I do not trust. In fact, I would say for the 300 years of data I've looked at, it's only kind of reliable in about 50% of the time. So you might as well toss a coin when you're deciding whether you think an EDM is giving you good, accurate data or not.
Thank you. Philippa, if you could just close this discussion point. Thank you.
I mean, I'm basically going to agree with what Peter just said, that a lot of the EDM data, the way how they've put the sensors in, does not produce accurate data. And so, you're meant to be measuring the height from the bottom of the weir, but you're actually hitting, the sensor actually hitting a completely different angle because of just how it's been put into the system. So just to sort of note that, yes, data is power, but when data is not accurate, it can mislead decisions.
Thank you. So yeah, I guess a huge step forward, but still a little bit of work to be done in terms of ensuring the accuracy and the repeatability and reproducibility of that information. Okay, Nikki, I think we'll move on.
Yeah, gosh, I think we could do this all day, couldn't we? So we've had quite a lot of points raised in the chat, which is still a source of great joy, actually. It's fascinating in there, all around source apportionment. And so we're talking quite understandably here about sewage pollution from water companies, from combined sewer overflows, but the water that's getting into the network, and we heard from several of our speakers earlier on in the keynotes, is coming from a range of sources. And Mark showed us, didn't he, longer term infiltration from rainfall, agricultural runoff, and highways runoff as well. So we've had some questions around source control and upstream thinking rather than building concrete tanks to hold water downstream. So I'm interested in the panel's view on how we could do that. Should we do that? What does good source apportionment look like? So and source control, excuse me. So over to our panelists. Who fancies going first on my source control question? Hoping you've all just accidentally gone on to mute. Who looks like they might be up for it? Art Worsfold, let's go with you first. What do you think? And then we'll come to you, Tom.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, for source control, absolutely. I'm completely behind that, particularly for new development. But we do need need to think about it in terms of retrofitting as well. It is a source of personal frustration that here we are 13 years after the Floods and Water Management Act was passed through Parliament, that Section 3 of the Floods and Water Management Act around SUDs and the enablement of SUDs for new development still has not been enacted. And what we do need to see is that become a requirement for all house builders to work through. But it's not just that, it's about the way developers interact with a whole host of different elements. So there's highway drainage. Highway drainage is dealt with by different people from other surface water. And really we need to be looking at holistic management of surface water, certainly for new developments. But we also need to look at how do we separate out some of those historic decisions that have been made around surface water entering into the combined sewers, and how do we separate those out. And retrofitting around a property, I completely get is going to be difficult, but there are lots of other pieces of innovation we can do. There's a lot of highway drainage, there's a lot of surface water in car parks and things like that, which are relatively simpler to separate, but they require multi-agency solutions to be developed. And at the end of the day, you know, we're seeing some really great innovation around the use of intelligent water butts and surface water being retained within properties and then released slowly after storms. And I think there's a great deal of innovation that can be brought into that space as well in terms of actually delivering real surface water separation at source.
Great, thank you, Mark. That's really helpful. Anyone else fancy coming in on this one?
Yeah,
Tom, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of focus on what we all use in the home actually. On average, we're using about 145 litres per person per day in the home. If you've got a treatment plant in your back garden, you're very well aware that you really must stick to the rules of the 3 Ps: poo, piss, and paper. Sorry, P.
Before the watershed, Tom. All right.
And I think a lot of the problems where some of the problems where you're going to get CSO spills will be due to blockages in the network. And then the amount that we actually all use, the target is to get to 120 litres per head per person per day. On many new developments, there's 100 litres. There's a sort of international move to get to 50 litres per person per day in terms of water usage. Well, if we use less, we're going to overwhelm the sewerage network a little less, aren't we?
Great, no, thank you. Although also some interesting stuff in the chat around at what point do you start to then create septicity in your sewers because you've not got enough water? So it's a balance, isn't it? No, if this was simple, we'd have done it years ago, I guess is the point really. Does anyone else want to come in on this question around source control? And maybe actually Karen or Pete or Giles, just thinking from a kind of campaign perspective, we're talking about the water sector, and this is not me trying to deflect the debate, but I'm interested, are you also having conversations given that you're interested in the kind of the quality of the water body itself with the likes of kind of the agricultural sector and highways? And I'm not picking on those two, it's just those are the other 2 big sectors that contribute. There are others, of course, but are those parts of the conversations that as campaigners you're having? Oh, that was a funny noise. Was that somebody? Oh, Giles, go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. Yeah, absolutely, we're having those conversations. We care about water quality. We campaign more specifically on sewage at the moment. We are looking at all toxics, obviously, in relation to water. That is really important. I think one of the problems, though, is that we talk about a water sector, right? And then we talk about an agricultural sector, and then we talk about an industrial sector, and then there's planning, and there's house building, and there's urban runoff, and we think of these things as siloed systems, rather than putting at the centre the water, right, and thinking of it as a valuable natural resource that we need. We need the clean water too, right? We need to be drinking water. We're at great risk of drought and this kind of thing. We haven't been building the reservoirs we need. So if we put water at the centre and then had joined up government to think about how we would manage that. So water is critical to life, it's critical to our economy. We've got a Climate Change Act that cuts across various aspects of our society and economy and manages, or is looking to manage carbon much better and create the transformation systems that we need to deliver our outcomes in terms of mitigating and adapting to climate change. We sort of need something, well, it's not sort of, we need something quickly in relation to water, similarly, that cuts across planning, that cuts across urban development, that cuts across agriculture, all of the cuts across the water sector, all the different areas that can be touched. Otherwise, if we keep dealing with it in a siloed way, we'll have siloed outcomes and they'll have knock-on and unintended consequences elsewhere. So we do definitely need to take a more holistic view.
Yes, I mean, gosh, wouldn't that be wonderful? And I am nodding furiously. You can see me, Giles. I'm absolutely in agreement with you. Anybody else want to come in on that point before we move on? Karen, go for it. Sorry, I couldn't see you there. Go for it.
Yeah, we are looking at agricultural pollution as well. We're currently doing expert-led testing on DNA in the water to see if pollution's coming from farm animals or people. So we are doing things like that, and we are looking at that problem as well.
Great, thank you. Brilliant, wonderful. I am going to hand back to Pete for our next question.
Nikki, yeah, so believe it or not, a long time ago in the chat, there's been so much chat come through. We had some questions around technology. So one of the recommendations from the report from the Royal Academy of Engineering around testing the water was to effectively implement more wide-scale use of disinfection. This was associated with our discharges from our wastewater treatment works, but also aligned with CSOs. And we've also heard comments from our speakers around particular types of pollution, such as microplastics. So the question is around whether we should be thinking about implementing these types of technology, particularly the disinfection and processes perhaps for removing contaminants like microplastics, and how we would go about doing that, because the cost of doing that across all of our wastewater system would be huge. So how do we go around implementing that technology? And as has been raised already, the fact that this will potentially have a quite significant carbon impact on the sector that's trying to become carbon neutral. So I'd like to open out that question. Who would like to take that one? Perhaps Mark, you're kind of at the coalface of this one. So could I ask you to start that one?
I did see the comments yesterday around UV disinfection, and in theory that sounds great. However, it is incredibly carbon intensive. I mean, we are probably one of the few companies that is operating a large level of UV disinfection. I think we've 68 sites from memory that are using that. It uses an incredibly high level of energy to do that, and we have it in place around discharges into shellfish waters and bathing waters. So I think we've got to be clear about where we're applying it and how we're applying it, because if we were to apply that across all of the wastewater treatment sites, I mean, in the southwest we have, again I'm going from memory, 665 665 treatment works, so that would be a 10-fold increase in the level of UV disinfection, and the cost of implementing that and the electricity and carbon that would be used to actually apply it would be quite challenging. UV is actually really quite difficult to apply in practice at low level flows, because actually getting the dose rate right is quite challenging. And actually we have real challenges, and the EA is still working through what a permitting methodology would be on rivers, because actually the majority of the dosing that is occurring is on coastal discharges at the moment. So there's some real practical issues with implementing UV, where it may look like it's a panacea, but actually there's a huge cost and it's really quite difficult to implement, particularly on those inland low flow sites.
Thank you. Tom, you've got your hand up. Oh, you're on mute, Tom.
Sorry, it was going to happen at least once. I think the question is what are we not going to be able to do if we did implement UV disinfection universally? I mean, the estimated it, as Mark says, you can put in the UV disinfection kit, but actually you'll need to have some unit operations upstream of the UV for removing solids. That adds to the overall cost. I mean, we've got and we've heard about microplastics, you know, but actually the gross pollutants, nitrogen and phosphorus, are massive issues, and they cause lots of environmental problems, and they cost a fortune to deal with. And I might argue that we should be dealing with those first and foremost. You know, some countries do apply final effluent disinfection. I've just been doing a project with the World Bank in India, where they're going to do that on one municipality, but they're going to use chlorine because they say it's the most reliable. Is that good news or bad news? I'm really not sure. And I think we can't underestimate the cost of treatment if you were to start to try and treat every combined sewer overflow, for instance. I mean, the bill would be in hundreds of billions if you were to merely for disinfection. So I think again, it's fantastic that we're now starting to actually identify where you should have inland bathing waters. We as a country have been very slow at doing that overall. But the idea that you can make every kilometre of every river free of pathogens, I don't think will happen. I mean, interesting to hear, Karen, that you're looking at coliforms in the wharf. I can bet you there'll be sort of high numbers when you go close to the source because of animal husbandry, not because of human pollution. I mean, as Giles, I'm sure, is aware, there've been a couple of incidents in recent years in North Devon. I think it was Saunton or Woolacombe, where the EA identified the source of coliforms was not sewage; it was actually animal husbandry. So, however much we deal with the CSO,
we're doing the DNA testing.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, and evidence from studies in other countries shows that, you know, if you have rainfall and you don't necessarily have a lot of animal husbandry and you don't necessarily have combined sewer overflows, you'll still get an increase in coliforms in water. So it's, you know, again, I'm going to be a typical academic and sort of say, oh gosh, yeah, it's a terribly complicated problem. But so I think that sort of the sledgehammer of applying universal disinfection, it's alluded to in the Royal Academy of Engineering report. I'm a fellow of that. I ought to be careful, but I was sat at the table with Chris Whitty in the first discussion. Chris was very keen on disinfecting everything. So I think he learned a lot about how difficult it is to treat wastewater and the costs involved over a couple of sessions. I'm just not sure that the benefits to the environment in the first place, to health secondly, are going to be worth disinfecting every single wastewater discharge.
Thank you. Any final comments on that one before we move on?
Could I ask a question? Do any of the other panelists know if it's possible to take out microplastics more at source? So, for instance, can you fit things on washing machines so microplastics can be taken out?
Yeah, Peter, we've been talking to some people who supplied retrofit kits for washing machines to absolutely take them out of the system. So before they even leave the washing machine, but also looking to lobby government and others to ensure that they are universally fitted in new kit. So it is available. Obviously, it has a cost implication, and they're looking at different models for doing that. But yeah, it's got to happen, hasn't it? Really.
Yeah, I know a little bit about microplastics, and I think control at source is the only way that you can really do that. And as our colleagues have already alluded to, treatment processes at the wastewater treatment works are going to be very, very challenging to specifically target a very small pollutant contaminant like that. So I think it really does need to be at source, control of that source. Okay, Nikki.
Yeah, thank you. Although Karen, you look like you wanted to come in. So before we move on, as
sorry.
you didn't know, it was a last minute hand. I didn't miss it, Pete. But Karen, did you want to come in before we do?
Just a quick one on the plastic pollution. When I first started, we were seeing things like sanitary products, Tampax, wet wipes, condoms going into the river from CSO outflows. Now, what we found was that a basic thing like screening, up-to-date screening, was not in place in a lot of CSO outlets. And that, once that we got onto Yorkshire Water and got the proper screening in place, made a huge difference to the amount of sanitary products and wet wipes and things like that going into the river. And that was just a basic thing that wasn't being done.
Great, thank you, Karen. And that actually takes me
Can I
really.
just, yeah,
Oh yes, you can.
just
Oh, you're
sort of to add on to Pete to answer Peter's question. Let's not forget that a lot of the microplastics that are appearing come from road runoff. Your car tyres are producing lots of microparticles. And yes, there is technology actually for people have tested. I can think of at least one French startup company that are putting sort of electrostatic devices into your wheel arches to capture some of those. And let's not forget, it's your choice of whether you're going to use clothing that are effectively plastics. That's where a lot of the microplastics come from. It is the washing machine end.
brilliant.
Sorry.
No,
Nikki.
you don't. No, it's absolutely. I love it. It's great. It's what we wanted. We wanted a bit of a debate. So I'm going to go off grid here. So Pete is going to panic because this is not what we've prepped. But we've got a bit more time than we thought, and I'm really interested in our panelists' views on public perception here, because we're sort of, talking to the choir, aren't we, a little bit? We've all given our time, whether you're watching this live or you're watching this on catch up, to listen to an hour and a half's conversation about storm over, 2.5 hours actually, about storm overflows. That's pretty geeky, and very happily in that geeky camp. But I guess most of us have probably had conversations with people outside the sector now. This is very much in mainstream news, and I'm interested in the panel's views on how do we communicate this better with the public. How do we engage with the public? And are things actually that we can ask the public themselves to do that will help solve some of the challenges we've talked about? So what can we do more of? And who fancies going with that first? Giles, can I throw to you first? Because I'm conscious that you had your big paddle out the other weekend, didn't you? So you've definitely been chatting to people about this recently, I'd imagine. I'd be keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it was just I was ruminating as you were talking on what can we do more of as the public. So but yeah, public perception. So yes, we're a campaigning organisation. We've worked tirelessly for 35 years nearly to drive public awareness of this issue. And what we have found is when people become aware of the extent of the issue, both in terms of what's happening in the environment, to human health, but also why it's happening and what the sort of state of the system, people get angry, right? They are angry about it. They've been like, hang on, I've been paying my bills all this time. What the hell's going on? So I think we had a kind of period of in the 90s, oh, things are getting better. And people sort of relaxed into that a bit. But as people have been out in the environment after COVID, enjoying reconnecting with nature, there's been this kind of a sort of big sigh of disappointment of like, oh God, it's not as healthy and it's not as good as I thought it was. So public perception is really, really key, and it's key to driving change, right? Without that kind of public anger, we wouldn't be seeing this pressure on the system to change now, right? So it is a good thing. We have to respond to the public around this. How we communicate it is really, really interesting. Greens, people, environmentalists, there are a number of them in society. Roughly about 20% of the population really care deeply about environmental issues. But 100% of people care about human health and public health, because we're all humans, and if it's affecting our lives and the quality of life, then that is a way. So we have found the health angle to be a very strong and good way to engage with a broader church of people who care about a now issue. What do people, can they do about it? I think people do want agency. Absolutely, they'd like to be able to know what they can do. It's often with these big systems, utilities, whether we're talking about climate and the energy system or whether we're talking about water and utilities, they can feel quite powerless in the face of large interests and corporates and government and regulators, etc. But Where there are things that are solutions that start at the home, I think people are really interested in them. They need to be packaged in a way that makes them accessible, have good data around them about what the impact is, what's the benefit, and for the home. But sustainable drainage systems, water butts, and things. Uptake is often good in trials that we've seen. So I think people would love to know and be enabled to do more that gives them some agency around this and can take very practical steps. But again, sorry, I'll just come back to the point though. Data is key, right? All of this is often about data, and so people need to be able to access the data to be able to understand what the situation is really like, and having that really available and communicated in a fashion that is meaningful for people, as opposed to technical experts or engineers or whatever. That really, really is key.
Great. Thank you, Giles. Love that. Philippa, do you want to come in next?
Hi, I was just wondering if I could bring in maybe an unintended consequence of public anger. I hope I don't upset anyone on the panel, but I'm probably the youngest person here.
Not necessarily
so
including the studio, Philippa. Just saying, keep going.
Of course. But when I tell people about what my project is, it's often like met with some like anger and sort of sometimes some quite foul language. So I've been trying to have a lot of conversations about people my age, about sort of people who maybe I would talk to when I was in my undergrad about 5 years ago, who were sort of interested in coming into the water industry, who have now completely turned away from and don't want anything to do with the water industry. And so this could end up being sort of like a knowledge gap as people sort of end up retiring and not being able to refill those positions because people don't want to work for those companies. And as we want more and more solutions to be built, that's going to be harder and harder if we have less and less people coming into the industry. And so that's sort of something that I've sort of experienced in sort of public anger, and sort of having that maybe, yes, we need public anger to drive things, but maybe also we need public to understand that if we want solutions, people are going to have to come into these jobs to fill them.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I'm really pleased, and I can see lots of nods as well, that you've raised the point around perception and therefore skills and the skills gap, because actually we're talking about a sector that's about to invest a significantly larger amount than they ever have, really. And actually we need arms and legs to do that work, and we need another generation of people to be custodians of the water environment. So it's a really important point to make, Philippa, even though you were slightly offensive to Pete and my ages, obviously. Mark, did you want to come in? I think you're on mute, Mark. Just try that one more time for us.
Yeah, there you go. I've hit the button now. I completely agree with the views, and I think one of the challenges we've seen with particularly social media at the moment is there are lots of myths and mirths about what the truth is and interpretations, and the media is going back and forth trying to present a picture, to lobby in a particular way, or to take data that was never meant to be presented in the way that's presented, but then it's being portrayed in lots of different ways. So I think there's a real cautiousness about when people say this is fact, whether it is fact or not, and is it actually an interpretation, because people are campaigning in a particular way to achieve a particular outcome in their campaign, but actually there's a question of, is that really the position? I mean, I'm being really clear, nobody comes into the water industry on a day-by-day basis and thinks, oh, I'm going to go pollute the environment today. That's not what we do. There are 55,000 people working in the water industry who come to work on a day-by-day basis, looking at how do they deliver their job and deliver it effectively. So we need to be very clear about that. And I find it very difficult with all the personalization of some of this that is going on as well, because I think that is inappropriate, and it reflects, there are some real challenges in the delivery of what is a very large program of work. And to build on Philippa's point, we are looking at 15 to 25 years worth of investment that is going to be required in order to improve storm overflows. Now, that's a whole career for a lot of people, and we need to be able to attract the best and the brightest to the industry to be able to deliver that in the most efficient way. And Philippa's quite right. We are seeing challenges where people entering the industry are hesitant to do that because of that reputational piece. And that's not going to help us solve the problem. So we do need to think about what does that mean, and when things are put into, you know, I'll take the example of the Dart yesterday, where there was lots of social media blaming South West Water for the pollution on the Dart yesterday. And actually, it was agricultural runoff from a field. It was nothing to do with South West Water, but there was a whole afternoon's worth of media around that, and social media on the attack and personalising that. And actually, the facts weren't known. So, if anything, I would ask everybody on social media to just reflect on: am I actually presenting the facts when we put these things out, and what do we need to do to verify the facts?
Great, thank you for that, Mark. Anyone else as a final comment wants to come in before we start to wrap this up? I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Wonderful. What a fascinating morning. I am mentally exhausted, but it's been brilliant. We've heard a really wide range of viewpoints, which I've loved, and I'm really mindful that there are views that we haven't heard here as well. There are, you know, we could have had a panel of 20 different stakeholders, but I think we've had a really lovely breadth. So thank you. I've certainly heard themes, I'm sure you have, Pete, as well, around the need to act across the board. You know, we're looking for common ground here. We need to act. The opportunity to use nature-based solutions. We've not talked about them loads, but we certainly heard that in our keynotes at the beginning, actually. How do we do this at pace, but also how do we balance that with the needs of the environment and the needs of not massively increasing our carbon footprint in order to get at a target really quickly? We were just talking there, weren't we, about the need to take people with us on this journey, the risk of unintended consequences around things like the skills gap that might develop if we end up taking an industry to pieces, and also the fact that we need more skills to come into this sector because there's so much more work to do. But there's also a role, and as Giles said, to help people feel like they can have agency over this topic themselves and take steps individually, which I think is really important. I've certainly seen in the chat that there are questions about value and how much we value our environment, how much we pay for our water. We certainly heard that in some of our keynotes. And those feel like questions that are still really big and outstanding. And funding mechanisms, you know, what should the sector look like? How do we fund it? And also systemically, somebody mentioned in the chat, do we need a water czar? You know, there are a few questions about who oversees all of this. Really big questions. We're not going to fix that in the morning, but for me, a combination of this debate plus the chat has set lots of neurons firing in my brain about what more we could do. So I think there's definitely something about recognising the balance of pace and the environment, recognising unintended consequences. But I think most importantly for me, this morning has been a really great opportunity for people to listen to each other, to start to find that common ground, and to crucially start to grow trust. And I think none of this will happen by one silo working alone. We've got to start seeing across those silos and connecting things together. So it's been really engaging. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for being here. And I hope you'll stay engaged with the discussion. Pete, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nikki. Yeah, just to reiterate some of the things that Nikki has said, really, it's been a really interesting and fascinating discussion. The chat has just gone crazy, and there's been some really good discussion on there. We've only probably covered maybe 5–10% of the points that have been raised, but between amongst yourselves, you've answered a number of those points. So I think that's fantastic. Yeah, what's come out for me is that it's great that the public are engaged, involved in this really important topic, but we do need to turn that anger, potentially, that interest, into a drive to make some positive change so that we don't lose those really important people that we're going to need in order to solve some of these very long-term problems, the fact it's going to take us a long time to resolve them. So it's going to need the fact that we're going to have to get more people, more of the stakeholders working together, and it is going to take time, and it is going to take money. But I think we are on that journey. We are now starting to talk to each other, and I think that's what has really been satisfactory for me today. So I think that's been really good. As Nikki mentioned, the event has been recorded, so if colleagues haven't seen it, we'll obviously pass those out to your colleagues, make sure that they get the chance to view it. But I do want to say a big thank you to Nikki for chairing the event, been really great, but also to our speakers, our keynote speakers and panelists who've been very civil with each other, which is which is great, but also added really successfully to the discussion. So thank you very much for being involved. So that brings us to a close. So thank you very much for attending. We will be having a debate next year on the topic. We don't know what yet. So if people have got any suggestions, do let us know. But on mine and Nikki's behalf, I'd like to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.